this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Lillard. I am a clinical forensic psychologist at WVU Medicine, Chestnut Ridge in Morgantown, and also the statewide forensic clinical director with Forensic Services housed in Sharp Hospital in Weston. I almost forgot my Thanksgiving favorite food. So I am a huge fan of sides. I could eat every side dish in Thanksgiving and give or take the turkey. So some side dishes that were not mentioned today that are my favorite are like hash brown casserole, sometimes called funeral potatoes, and green bean casserole. I get in trouble for putting too many starches on the table. I'll do like mashed potatoes and hash brown casserole and sweet potatoes. And everyone says I have too many potatoes, but it's Thanksgiving. Calories don't count.
I need to come to your house for Thanksgiving, man.
Sounds like a plan. All right. So today I thought we might do a somewhat different topic that I don't think we've done here for psychiatry echo before. Let me share my screen before I get chatting with you all. Did I do that wrong? Were you guys right the first time? What do
You got
see?
it.
Okay. You just see the slides?
Yep.
Okay. So I know that we have a huge group of experts from the CED that are always participating well in echo, and I was kind of trying to come up with a topic that was kind of near and dear to their hearts, but also kind of interacts with what I do on a daily basis. And I thought, let's spend some time talking about autism spectrum disorder and the legal system. And so there's a lot of different angles that we can take this conversation. And so this is just one little, this is my little take on it today, but please, you all are the autism developmental disabilities experts. So please interject with any case examples or questions you may have as we go. I definitely would say I'm more of the expertise on the legal side of things, but I thought that the intersection between these two topics is very relevant and important to us. So today, what I'd like to do is kind of cover two areas. I want to briefly give an overview of autism. And by brief, I mean really, really brief. And then I want to give an overview of the criminal justice system. And so today, to talk about the intersection of autism, we could even talk about developmental disabilities kind of in a more general sense. I want to use what we call the sequential intercept model. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but it's a way for us to kind of visualize the steps of the legal system and involvement with law enforcement that a person can go through. And it was created in 2006, initially for severe mental illness. And so the idea was if we can identify all these phases or places that people interact with the legal system, we can use them to target as ways to pull people with mental illness out of the system. And so it's a nice way for us to kind of break down and conceptualize where people with any kind of mental illness, but then specifically today, people with autism spectrum disorders, where they might fall into the legal system, and then what concerns we might have and what strategies we might use to kind of pull them out of the system if we can. And most of this talk today is based upon this paper that I thought was excellently done. And it's a systematic review of autism spectrum disorders and the criminal justice system. And it looks at policy gaps and opportunities, and it uses a sequential intercept model. So I can have Kelly give you a copy of that paper with my PowerPoint today so that you can take a look at it. So let's talk very briefly about autism spectrum disorder, what that looks like, what do we mean when we're talking about autism spectrum, just to make sure we're all using the same language and on the same page. So DSM-5 text revision is our current diagnostic and statistical manual, which means that I've been in the field too long. Since Nick and I were both trained on the DSM-4 text revision, and we've got 2 new generations of DSM. But there's kind of three main areas that we want to think about when we're talking about a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And we can look at them as problems or difficulties or deficits. I think the DSM likes to use that word deficit. But the first is problems with social interaction. And so using the language of the DSM, they're talking about persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, manifested in a variety of ways. This could be deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So this could be difficulty in social situations approaching, not being able or struggling to have that back and forth conversation, difficulty sharing interests with other people or emotions or affect, or failing to initiate or respond to social interactions. That's one type of social interaction deficit. Another deficit could be in nonverbal communicative behavior. I think the one that always comes to mind first is lack of eye contact, but it can be a lot of different nonverbal communications, difficulties understanding body language, understanding and or using gestures to help people understand what they're thinking, how they're behaving, what they're feeling. Could be a lack of facial expressions or other forms of nonverbal communication. So we have problems with social interaction with reciprocity, the back and forth, with nonverbal communications, or deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. This could be difficulty adjusting behavior to fit various social contexts. Specific to what we'll talk about today is maybe difficulty shifting expectations between how you act around your friends and how you act in front of a law enforcement officer. Difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, absence of interest in having friends or engaging in similar interests as your peers. So that's one area of autism spectrum disorder. The second is problems in communication. Give me one second here. And we talked about some of those in the kind of nonverbal communication. We've talked about it kind of in the form of social interactions, but there's trouble kind of with the communication. And then we've got problems dealing with change. And so with this difficulty of dealing with change comes along with it restrictive interests. And so this may be kind of, fixated on specific interests. And it could be abnormal in like the intensity, like how much they only want to talk about one area, one topic, one item. Or it could be in intensity, it could be abnormal in focus. So it could be maybe they just perseverate on the topic. It could also be that they, it's not just cars they're focused on, but they're really focused on maybe the wheels of a car. And then we look at, problems dealing with, with change means like a lot of rigidity around routines, a lot of need for sameness, inflexibility. They've got an adherence to routines, ritualized pattern of verbal or non-verbal behavior. They have a hard time transitioning or to dealing with new environments. And I think we can imagine how working the criminal justice system and law enforcement could really be a problem when it comes to that insistence of sameness. There also could be repetitive motor movements. There could be, they're sometimes called stimming, ways to kind of like sensory, to slow down sensory issues. We could have different simple motor movements that they do over and over again. There could also be, it could be repetitive words or statements said over and over again. And oftentimes difficulty with sensory input as well. So autism spectrum disorder in a nutshell, we're looking at problems in social interaction, problems in communication, as communication is a part of our social interactions, right? And problems dealing with change with restricted interests and restrictive behaviors. So if we take our understanding of this disorder, and then we add into it this idea or the criminal justice system. And so I'll give you a brief overview here, but then I want you guys to put your thinking hats on and tell me kind of off the top of your heads, what do you think some of the difficulties individuals with autism may have when dealing with the criminal justice system? So let's first talk about that sequential intercept model. This sequential intercept model looks at, sometimes they're called 5 intercepts, sometimes people will put in a 6th one, and they break down different areas of the legal system. And we'll look at one in a lot more detail than this, but this is a nice brief overview. It starts with Intercept 0. These are the community services. Intercept 0 is the place just before any law enforcement interaction. So this is all of our supports and resources to help people. Like I said, it started with mental illness, to help people with mental illness, developmental disabilities, function in their communities. This is before any contact with law enforcement. Intercept 1 is that initial contact with law enforcement. And so that's like the beginning of an investigation. And then we shift into Intercept 2, where we're looking at, okay, a person's initial detention into jail and all the beginning court hearings. So this is where, for me in the forensic world, we start looking at evaluations for competency to stand trial or criminal responsibility for the crime. This could include resources and treatment services while people are in jail, or if they need to come to the forensic hospital, if they need some community resources before their legal case. Intercept 3, this is like the trial process or the plea bargaining, the kind of disposition and sentencing part. This also is the part where individuals are incarcerated in prison. So think of like Intercept 2 as being all of the like early stuff in a legal process. Intercept 3 being your time that you're incarcerated, sentenced, incarcerated. And then to me, I like to kind of put together 4 and 5 as re-entry community corrections, but it's the idea of preparing somebody who's been in prison for returning to the community, and then not only preparing them, which is kind of Intercept 4, but Intercept 5 is actually them being placed back into the community. And what do we need set up in place so that we can reduce the likelihood they re-enter the criminal justice system in the future? So we have now overviewed autism spectrum disorder, and we've overviewed the steps in the process of the criminal justice system. So I want to open it up for thoughts on, if we think back to the criteria that are met when we diagnose an autism spectrum disorder, how might those problems, those kind of deficits interfere, could be positively or negatively, with the justice system? What are you guys thinking?
Certainly imagining the whole processing part, all just the environmental changes, losing access to so many of me, the familiar things, the ways, to get to self-soothe or whatever. And then having that just uncertainty of what's going to happen to me. How can I get, information from others, and really having difficulty without having that social and reciprocity potentially, and being able to gather information, make sense of what's happening to you.
Yeah. Very good, Nick. You're kind of thinking that Intercept 2, right? Just after that initial law enforcement contact, but then like what happens at processing? What happens when they first get to jail and they are overloaded with new environments? I mean, talk about sensory overload. Jails are bright, they are loud, they are smelly, it is the epitome of sensory overload, and they now have none of the things that they use to kind of cope and deal with that. Thank you. Other thoughts on how the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder could interfere with the legal system?
So I'm thinking about, because of having those deficits, these individuals also have a lot of interactions with paid supports. And so when something does go awry, a paid support, it seems like is a lot more likely to not necessarily know what to do. And then a lot of times their first fallback is to call the law because we don't have enough services and supports. Then law enforcement comes, their only tool is arrest people and send them to jail. And so there you go. And so it just makes it really difficult, because there a lot of times folks are around people who do not who are not natural supports. They don't love them and care for them and have all of that empathy and understanding and willingness to try a little harder and deal with a little bit more. They're just like, oh, wow, this is not good. 911.
Yeah. Deborah, lots of really good points there. I think you're looking at intercept 0 and intercept 1 here is what you're kind of focused on. But yes, so they may have paid support, so they may have kind of support staff where they're living, and we'll talk about, there was a study done on parents of autistic adults and talking about why they see law enforcement interactions increase in a little bit. But yeah, definitely, you know, maybe more quick to call 911 or less willing to kind of tolerate that ambiguity or calm the situation in a way that doesn't require law enforcement. And unfortunately, I think everyone here today was in the state of West Virginia, but it is, as I know Deborah knows, it's really, we really struggle with community services and having the right support systems in the first place. And then once you involve law enforcement, it just gets harder from there. Other thoughts?
I also wanted to add with that intercept 1 with law enforcement, the lack of training of law enforcement and understanding the different deficits with the individuals with ASD, you know, not making eye contact, not responding to their name, maybe running away, and then the maltreatment of those individuals because of the lack of training of law enforcement. We hear and see that all the time.
Heather, I think you have predicted my presentation today. We're actually going to watch a really brief video that was given to law enforcement for training purposes about how to interact with individuals. And I would agree. I actually think West Virginia is doing some really good things. I don't know, was anyone here involved in the training? There was a law passed a couple of years ago that required or encouraged law enforcement to all receive training on ASD. And I think Health Affairs and WVU Medicine gave a big presentation to law enforcement over a series of days about ASD. And I'd be really interested to hear how people thought that went, how were the presentations, and it'd be really great if someone was collecting data to see if it changed anything, because I think that's what we'll talk about later. The concern from researchers is that, yeah, we can throw some of that education out there, but does it change how they actually interact with individuals? So you guys have hit a lot of my points today. I do want to show this super busy slide. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna break down this slide by each of those different colored areas, and we're gonna have a slide for each of them. So don't feel like you have to review this or memorize it. But this is a kind of look at the sequential intercept model as discussed for people with developmental disabilities, including ASD, as both offenders in the juvenile or in the criminal justice system and as victims and witnesses, which is why I think this is such a cool slide to take a look at. But I want to break each one of them down. And I like that this slide it talks about things we can do. So, you know, what can we do in teaching? And so this is like, what can we do in teaching individuals with autism who are offenders? And then what can we do for them? What can we do to teach them, to give them accommodations and supports if they're victims and witnesses as well? So we're going to start at intercept 0. And so these are kind of shifted a little bit from what we talked about before, but I think it still works out. So if we think about intercept 0, as that kind of like just before or first contact with law enforcement, that review paper looked at some issues that the research had found about what happens when people with ASD interact with law enforcement. And they found that the biggest issue is the baseline lack of supports or maladaptive supports in the community. So if there's not enough intermediate supports and resources in a person's community, it increases the likelihood that they're going to have some sort of involvement. There could be some sort of involvement with law enforcement. And so in my mind, this makes me think of, do we have enough, individual outpatient support things? Do we have that intermediate, maybe crisis intervention responses so we don't have to get law enforcement involved, which here's the spoiler for everybody. We don't have good crisis intervention services in West Virginia, particularly with ASD and developmental disabilities. And so do we have all those intermediate levels that can kind of buffer from needing to involve law enforcement? There was a survey done with autistic parents, and they found that there was more, the parents told the researchers that their family members were more likely to have interactions with police and law enforcement if there was poor access to services in their community, and if the individual with autism was living away from the parents. So I think that goes directly to Deborah's point, that if they're living away from parents, so either they're living away from parents and maybe they don't have all of the life skills that they need to be living on their own, or instead of the kind of natural supports, they've got the paid support systems. And so it makes sense what Deborah was saying about them being more involved with law enforcement if they're paid support system than if it was a natural support. They also found that individuals who have autism and who also had some sort of offending behavior, they were more likely to have obsessive interests, be socially naive, and have a misunderstanding of the law. So they found that those were some of the reasons why individuals with autism got involved with the criminal justice system. And so if we look to the right-hand side here at the first contact line of that big map we're talking about, it talks about, areas of concern here. So there's like the dispatchers, that's going to be one area. And then there's like the arrests, what happens in communication, physical limitations of the individual, law enforcement's response time. Mirandas are the rights. Everybody, that's from the old cop show, you have a right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney. If you don't have an attorney, one will be appointed to you. And a person has to waive that right knowingly and intelligently in order to like provide a statement to law enforcement, right? You have a right to remain silent, but that person has to know and understand what it means to have a right to remain silent. Or you can get involved in the Miranda rights were violated. This is also the place that we could do diversion. Rather than placing this person who is in distress into handcuffs in the back of a police car and taken to jail, which in Mon County means driving down to Doddridge, an hour and 15 minutes south of here, we could divert them. Is this a mental health crisis? And although, maybe the ED isn't the perfect place and where we want to send them, but maybe that's what they need. Those services are what they need, or they need a crisis response with a social worker rather than law enforcement. And then on the other side, for people with autism spectrum disorder, we're looking at them as victims and witnesses, because they're much more likely to be a victim of a crime than they are to be an offender, although sometimes we only see them as offenders. And so this is saying that, and there's another slide where I'll get into this a little bit, but it's this distrust that people who have had negative interactions with law enforcement begin to distrust law enforcement. And one of the ramifications of that is that if they begin to distrust law enforcement, they don't call 911 even when there is a true medical or true emergency. And so this is talking about how really kind of educating and teaching individuals that they have to call 911 in an emergency. You have to make that report, even if they're kind of weary and afraid of law enforcement. And the goal would be that 911 is dispatching officers that can really understand the issue when they're coming. And then it talks about referring individuals to victim services, even if charges aren't filed against whoever perpetrated that offense. Questions on Intercept 0 and maybe like the support services before getting in law enforcement contact? Okay, so we'll move on to Intercept 1. Intercept 1 is really that kind of that investigation. So it's not just like, okay, calling 911 or calling for them to come, but it's they've arrived they are doing their investigation. They are person's being initially detained. They have their first appearance, all that kind of very beginning stuff of the investigation. Research suggests that individuals with ASD are 7 times more likely to interact with law enforcement compared to individuals without autism spectrum disorder. And so when I'm thinking about individuals with autism spectrum disorder coming into contact with law enforcement, I kind of think about it as 2 separate groups. There are individuals with ASD who have incidental contact with law enforcement because of characteristics and behaviors that they're engaging in. This to me is different than a person with autism who is committing a crime and coming into contact with law enforcement because of that, but that the interaction then maybe gets derailed or is a lot more violent than it needs to be because the person has autism spectrum disorder. So in the first one, these are incidents that sometimes these people will end up all the way into Sharp Hospital, and I get very furious. And I know DRWV gets very frustrated too. But this is when someone is having an argument with family, or maybe they're having a mental health crisis. Family calls law enforcement to do a mental hygiene. Law enforcement comes and the individual gets scared and pulls away from the law enforcement officer and gets a charge of resisting arrest, or gets a charge of battery on an officer because when they pulled away, they elbowed them in the nose. So that to me is a completely different issue and area that happens and that we need to work to change, versus somebody has autism spectrum disorder. They're also committing illegal acts and crimes, even if that's maybe because of impulsivity or because of restricted interest, like it may be related to their autism spectrum disorder. But I think that those are different questions and concerns. And I bring this up. I wanted to briefly watch a video. We're going to watch 2 videos on with Intercept 1 because I think Intercept 1 is really important. This first one, they have really brief law enforcement body cam footage of this 15-year-old who was killed in Apple Valley, California in March of this year, 2024 maybe. And he was killed. Law enforcement was brought to the house because he was acting violent towards his family. He had broken the front door. So to me, kind of fits into that second area where he's doing dangerous behavior, and then law enforcement gets involved. But you'll see that law enforcement got involved, and then it ends tragically. It does not show him getting shot, but it's a little bit of a challenging video to watch, just as a heads up. I might have to stop sharing real quick and reshare again.
Help, Inland Empire
you
Bureau
share?
Chief Rob McMillan reports.
Okay. So we're not actually going to watch that video, but I wanted to see that one. So here's the news article. I picked this case mostly because I actually graduated from high school in Apple Valley, California, and I was like, oh no, this was in my at one time backyard. We're going to watch this clip though. This is law enforcement's body cam of the incident.
His name is Ryan Gaynor, 15 years old. He was shot and killed as he came at a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy with what investigators say was a gardening tool.
Body cam video and a 911 call reveal what led up to that shooting. Inland Empire Bureau Chief Rob McMillan has the story. Where is he at? Body camera video showing the moment a 15-year-old boy comes charging at a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy holding what authorities say is a gardening tool. The video stopping right as the deputy opens fire. That 15-year-old, identified as Ryan Gaynor, is dead.
Ryan is a 15-year-old with autism. Sometimes in order to release stress or if he's a little too worked up, he'll go on a run.
Attorney DeWitt Lacey says that's exactly what happened on Saturday afternoon.
But when he came back, there was a dispute that arose because he wanted to play video games and he needed to do his chores. And he started acting out.
That's when Gaynor's sister called 911, saying Gaynor had already attacked his other sister.
So that's your brother and he's assaulting your sister?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now he's banging on the door.
Then about 30 seconds later,
He don't broke the door. He's breaking the window.
Okay, so has he broke the window?
Now he broke it. Back to your room. Work in your room, Becca. Work in your room.
nowhere on the 911 call did we hear family members saying anything to the dispatcher about Ryan's mental state. But one neighbor who spoke with us off camera said deputies had been to the home before.
Here lately, he'd been struggling a little bit with some things, but he was basically a good kid.
Still, even after watching the video, he doesn't think the deputy should have fired.
You know, I could see if it was a knife or a gun or something, but it seemed excessive to me.
But another neighbor said despite the tragic outcome, he thinks the deputy acted appropriately.
When an officer is attacked with any kind of weapon, especially in a
Right. What do you guys think? What's your reaction to that? That's just one example.
I think the second neighbor had a good point of view of anytime someone's going after an officer, it doesn't matter what it is, but then like the first neighbor said that the officers, had responded to the address before. You can't guarantee you're getting the same officer every time, and it's also officers aren't necessarily a caseworker to follow like one particular person. So remembering that he was on the spectrum is not something that they would necessarily remember. So that's hard. Someone in the family should have also told that whenever they called. Like, I don't know why the sister wouldn't have been like, my brother, he's on the spectrum. This is what's wrong. However, this is what's going on now.
Other thoughts?
I know officers usually carry tasers as well. So could have drawn that instead of a firearm, maybe.
Yeah, that was my first thought was why are we coming in with our gun in front of us? Could he have used a taser? Could there have been a conversation? Could there have been a less lethal alternative?
Yeah, we also didn't even hear the entire 911 phone call. So we don't necessarily know if they disclosed it, that he has ASD and everything. And I know often, like, if there's people that officers see frequently, like, they become like a frequent flyer, like they would call him like an ED or something. Oftentimes everybody knows as well. So I don't know if that was the case or not, but
yeah, I'm not quite sure how 911 dispatch services, like how their like computer system works, but it makes you wonder if something could be put into place that this family has been there before. We know that the kid, has a mental illness, a developmental disability, and that he could almost flag the call so that anytime a call comes in from that number, they know to tell law enforcement, hey, this house, this is what's going on. These are what you could be walking into, if that would have helped in any way. If we can, can you send an officer who has special training? Those types of issues.
yeah, I know, like, I worked in Harrisburg, PA for a year, and we worked with law enforcement often because I was a case manager in the community. And we had like a frequent flyer that would often have to have police called for crisis and everything, but all the officers knew him by name, and like they're like, okay, it's just him being himself kind of thing.
Yep. Which, can go one of two ways, right? You hope that would help calm the situation and that they'd be able to come in with a different perspective, and be able to kind of de-escalate the situation. I also find in forensic services sometimes we have the people that they label as like frequent flyers, and they just get fed up going to the house over and over again, and they say, okay, enough's enough. Now you're gonna go to jail.
Yeah. I also wanted to add, in Harrisburg, they have a police officer that responds, but they also have like a social work degree or a social work background, so they're able to de-escalate. So if there's anything mentioned in regards to mental health or anything, that person is dispatched.
That's a great thought for something we need more of in West Virginia. We're at the point of training a lot of officers in like CIT, crisis intervention training, but we're not at a place where we've got, mobile crisis where more social work can go rather than law enforcement. So another issue in Intercept 1, they talk about that distrust and the fear that people, when they have these really negative interactions with law enforcement, they become too scared to reach out in true emergencies. This comes into play when they're victims. And then, as I think Heather mentioned earlier, it talks about training law enforcement. And that's that law enforcement recognizes that they have struggle when they come into contact with a person with autism, and that they don't know what they need to know about how to interact and how to de-escalate. And they want to have safer resolutions. But we don't yet know if the training is improving outcomes. We know that they gain more knowledge after a training, but we don't know if gaining that knowledge changes how they interact in a like face-to-face situation. So one more video for us. Oh, sorry.
So while you pull that up, Colleen, so my cousin, he is a police officer in Texas, and one of the things, it may be a smaller department, but what they do whenever a dispatcher is calling them out, they'll bring up anything that they have in the past and like go over it with them. So I think that helps, and he's also kind of higher up with his training and stuff. I don't know why everyone doesn't do that.
Yeah, I would agree. This is a video for law enforcement to train them about interacting with people with autism. So it may be a chance for us to talk about some ways that they did well, and maybe ways that maybe this isn't the best kind of training. But I thought it might be helpful to see from law enforcement's perspective, what does it look like? Can you hear?
I can't.
Nope.
What are you doing?
Oh, wait, now I can.
What? What is that? Stop walking away from me. It's a street. Okay, so why are you bouncing around all the way? You have any ID on you? No. Don't go anywhere. All right, just relax. Okay. Okay. Slowly, keep your head facing forward. Look at me. Follow it with your eyes and your eyes only. Keep your arms at your side. I'm not interested no more. Hold on. Okay, you're not gonna do it. All right, do me a favor. Put your hands behind your back real quick. Put your hands behind your back. I'm telling you.
As police officers, you interact with people on a daily basis. Frequently, when you respond to calls for service, you may interact with people under the influence of alcohol or drugs.
However, people who are diagnosed with autism display very similar characteristics. It may be difficult for you as a police officer to distinguish between a person diagnosed with autism and someone under the influence. Although there are many signs of autism, here are a few distinguishable symptoms that you could look for.
Hello, sir. How are you today?
Today.
Repetitive words, also known as echolalia, is one common symptom of someone with autism. Overstimulation is another common symptom of someone with autism. Loud noises, bright lights like the overheads on your patrol vehicle, and shiny objects will all distract someone with autism. Stimming is self-stimulatory. You may see someone with autism rubbing their hands and fingers together. You may also see them rocking in place.
Sir, you doing okay? You all right?
As you approach someone with autism, you may see intensified stimming. This is a symptom of high anxiety. If the situation permits, provide ample space between you and the person whom you're interacting with. If you do need to use open hand control with someone who is autistic, you can expect them to react with hypersensitivity that you may perceive as noncompliance. Prior to using open hand control or handcuffing, attempt to explain in detail what is about to occur.
I need you to put your hands behind your back.
This may reduce the chance of a negative reaction and possibly gain compliance.
I need to put these on you.
People who have been diagnosed with autism may be on prescribed medication. To determine whether the person is under the influence of drugs or alcohol or on their prescribed medication, try not to ask open-ended questions that could be misinterpreted by someone with autism.
Did you take anything today?
Be specific to get a more appropriate response.
Do you have meds that you take daily? Did you take them today?
Yeah.
Using short words and gestures will greatly assist in communicating with the person you're speaking with.
ID? Johnny?
It may be necessary to allow someone with autism extra time to process your questions. Be sure to allow ample time for their response.
You're safe.
If the situation permits and you're able, reassure the person that they are not in danger and that you're only there to help them.
Great. I want to make sure to give us some time today. So we made it through. We made it through a couple we made it through intercept 1. We talked about 0 and 1 early, the early pieces of the criminal justice system, but I think really important ones. I think talking about community resources, that initial contact with law enforcement is really important. The other phases, get into, how to about interviewing individuals with autism who are witnesses to a crime. And it talks about using supportive interviewing. And it goes into something like the video where it's talking about, we need to not ask leading questions, but we also can't ask really broad, open-ended questions that are going to lead to confusion. And that it might be helpful if they can have a support person that's with them to help answer any of those questions. And then it kind of gets into, the level of treatment and the supports needed while they're incarcerated, if it gets to that point. And then transition and community release and the community supports that are needed in place again. So I wanted to open it up with our last 7-8 minutes to thoughts, questions.
Colleen, because our program here at PBS is really resource heavy on some of the services that we provide and including resource information in the trainings, can you recommend who a family would go to for legal help? Like, is it legal aid? Is there like this, would it be disability rights advocates? Like, what is the best option for families that find themselves in this situation?
I'm going to ask Deborah if she has thoughts on this, but before I answer, because I'm not exactly sure.
So once a person gets into that system, there's not much that disability rights can really do because it's, it's in a judge's hands at I mean, once you get in that system, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can't stop those wheels from turning. So, I mean, really the best thing is the focus on community supports, home and community-based services. I mean, that's really the place that we would definitely like more stuff to happen, but that's really a good place to do what we can to intervene. And so that would be my response to that. After the fact, like, I know like here, it's really hard for us to do anything other than just try to long-term plan down the road. How can we get this person, when we do get to the other end, what can we set up for them to stay out of this system in the future? And then also I tend to look for patterns of different agencies, organizations that we tend to hear problems coming out of a lot that might need some teach, reteach supports to help them do better when they're interacting with people. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I would say for families in that moment, there's already been an arrest, they're being processed. One, I would say, on the outset, if you've got an individual that maybe has some violent tendencies when they're overstimulated, or maybe you think there's an increased likelihood they're going to have a contact with law enforcement, I think the kind of training them how to interact with law enforcement, why law enforcement is going to ask you these questions, what this means when they say these things, like almost like prepping them for how to interact to make it go as smooth as possible. Then once they're involved in that system, I think legal aid or just another attorney is going to be really helpful to the family. We want to shorten the amount of time that they're having to be detained. And so finding ways to get them out of jail and back into the community, either on bond, or, if they're sitting in jail, you might want to consider having the attorney think about competency, and then you got to get the ball rolling on a competency evaluation. And that can be a really long drawn out process. When it comes to forensic services, the lawyer needs to contact forensic services. The lawyer has to call to get an evaluation set up, but the family can keep calling the lawyer to say, hey, have you done this? Have you done this? And kind of stay on top of them there.
Yeah, and I would add sometimes disability rights attorneys can provide technical assistance to criminal attorneys to help them understand more of what's going on and maybe suggest the ways to move through the process that's going to reflect the disability more.
That helps a little bit, Heather. You can always give me a call. we can work through it on a case-by-case basis.
I also
So Colleen, I have sort of a different question.
Go ahead.
One of the things that still strikes me, and this just isn't for autism, but sort of all mental health included, is just how wildly different each kind of county and district handles it. I mean, I think that to me is the most absolutely challenging thing, because one county can handle it like literally 180 degrees different than the other. And so, I mean, it makes it very hard. And sometimes things that have worked in one county to get the right response have actually not worked in the other county and caused and again, it's just that lack of sort of collaboration, so that everybody's working together to the same goal that I think we're all really trying to move toward. But is there any way for a family to know or have like a resource to know what the options are in their area? Because I mean, I think that is the most mind-shattering thing to me, is just how diametrically different some of the responses can be.
Yeah, I'm not sure the best avenues. My initial thought is community mental health centers are unfortunately probably the resource that best knows the area. But we know how difficult those can be to interact with.
might lead into the resource that I was going to bring up. I know our folks at the Office of Maternal and Child Family Health always mention this on calls. I think they're available in all counties now, but I think it's through Help for West Virginia. But there are mobile crisis response units, I think, in every to get through them. But just wanted to bring up the resource that's potentially there in most counties.
Yeah, I think they're supposed to be in most counties, and I think 988 is probably still a great resource to go to, right? Because that's supposed to direct you as kind of close to your local services. Help for West Virginia has a website that lists a lot of information too, so that's a really good resource. I think some counties' mobile crisis is better than others. At least that's been kind of my experience. And more so for kids than adults, would people say, is still with the mobile crisis. But yeah, the Help for West Virginia, it's HELP, the number 4 WV, has a website with a lot of resources on it as well.
I think, and the other thing I think is getting better. So I always want to acknowledge progress, but I still see that even coming through those lines with the 988 or the calling for mobile crisis. Sometimes they don't always send mobile crisis. Sometimes they choose to send police, and then sometimes it's the opposite. It even on the dispatch side, I'm not sure that it's always consistent in different areas either. I'm always kind of that's part of the perplexing sort of lack of consistency, and I do think it's getting better, but I still think it's pretty variable. I mean, there are some you'll call mobile crisis and the families always are told we can't help you, call police, and then sometimes it's the opposite in other places. So I don't know if those are decisions made kind of at that local level or if that's the clearinghouse 800 number, but those are the things I can't quite sort of understand, because it does again seem very different. Do you know, does anybody know who, if you call 988 who makes those decisions on what to send? I mean, it may just be the person that's the dispatcher that makes their best choice too. I don't know the protocols for those things.
Yeah, I don't know the protocols either. And I know it probably depends on where, because I know sometimes you call 988 and I think you get more of like a national level response than you're getting like a in-state response. Or if you can get an in-state response, so you're not getting a response close to your county. It would be good data for the Department of Human Services to be collecting, but they have lots of data they could be collecting. Maybe Aetna needs to collect it.
I think one of our issues in this state, I think, is the lack of resources, like you mentioned earlier, for like mobile crisis. And I believe children's mobile crisis goes up to a certain age. And then I think it would be 988 for young adults and up, right? So, but I have heard from families that I've triaged coming into PBS that have already had an experience or interaction with law enforcement or having to use mobile crisis, is they've given up on mobile crisis because they either take too long and the situation's over and the episode is over and the person's eloped, or they were able to regulate and help that individual calm down, or the people that they sent out are not adequately trained either. They're very green to that, to crisis work. And so that's, again, that brings us back to that, like, where can we train more? What can we do? And I'm always thinking in that side of my brain, because that's what I do here for our program, is what trainings can we get out there, So, but I do know from our client experience is that they give up on mobile crisis.
I will say from a kind of systems level perspective, last year, a group that I coordinated with, we were tasked with kind of doing this sequential intercept model mapping for adults with mental health problems, juveniles with mental health problems, the IDD, developmental disability population, and substance abuse. And so we put together a very long 250+ page report, presented it to the legislature. So at least and a lot of it talked about the lack of community resources and talked about the needs that we have. So I think we're starting to get people at that systems level to hear it. I think that's part one. And then I know, we'd like to do a push to start enacting or engaging more. I know when it comes to specifically the IDD population, I mean, we have 0 crisis stabilization beds for people with intellectual disabilities, which means they're going to jail, they're going into the state psychiatric hospitals where they do not belong. And then because we don't have the resources in the community, we're not able to get them out of the state psychiatric hospitals. And I mean, forensic services are seeing a huge increase in the number of people with intellectual disabilities coming into the forensic system over the past year. And so I think that it's definitely conversations that have to be had, but we need diversion options. We need to get the people out of the system and get them the treatment and help they need. Thank you, everyone. I don't want to keep everybody too far over. I'm sure Kelly has announcements.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. And if you want some time, we can always set it up so you can present the other portion of it, no problem. I just want to let you guys know that our next session is going to be on December 4th. It's going to be on similarities and differences, diagnosing depressive disorder with psychotic features. We're going to have Lauren Swiger presenting that one. So hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving with all the goodies and I guess all the stuffing that y'all love. And we will see you in the beginning of December.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.